was typing this in about looking up existential need when I wrote this. And it was so sad to see some of these answers. Many people have turned to drugs to find their existential need, right? To fill that void. And some of them have said there's just no meaning to life, right? But the Christian, right? It's different because you unapologetically know that the answer to your existential question, if you come to know Jesus as your Savior, it's by grace you have an answer, right? It's by grace you have an answer to that question, the existential question that plagues our culture. There's nothing in us, right? And we're called into a culture that doesn't recognize that void, you're in need of a Savior. That's the only thing that's going to fill that void. We're called into a culture that has an existential cry for a Savior, seasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there. Okay, so let's see how Paul does this. How does he take a hard look at the culture he lives in? How does he see the culture for what it is? How does he recognize the existential need and apply the gospel? What's going on here in this text? There is Paul, and he's in Athens. And he was waiting for Silas and Timotheus. And his eyes were open. His eyes were wide open. He's observing everything around him. And we have to ask the question, what was Athens like at that time? Like, you're in the first century, and you're walking next to Paul. What was Athens like in the first century? Athens was quite a city. Athens would have been spectacular to see. We still have remnants of Athens now, which are pretty spectacular to see. It would have been quite an experience to see Athens at its height. And at its height, there would have been drama. There would have been literature, right? There would have been art, the Olympic Games, right? Maybe you would have seen those. Philosophy would have been there. Science, you would have seen science there. The developments of democracy would have been there in Athens. And this place is just oozing with culture. And there is Paul, and he's walking around Athens in the first century, and he's seeing this. Now, Paul is not isolated from the culture. He's walking around, and he's got his eyes wide open. And my suspicion is that he is taking mental notes of everything he sees. He's looking at all that Athens has to offer, right? He's looking at the culture. And he's walking down side roads. And as he's walking down side roads, he's getting a feel for this place called Athens. And what does it look like? What are the people into? What does it smell like? What sounds am I hearing, right? And one of the things that he notices is it's a city full of idols, right? And there's a writer by the name of Petronius, a contemporary writer at Nero's court. He says that it was easier to find God, a lowercase g God, in Athens than a man. The writer in that century who said it was easier to find one of those lowercase g gods than an actual man. That goes to say something about that culture. I think if I put it right there. Yeah, there it is. The guy's name is Petronius. And the fact that there are gods, lowercase g gods, everywhere in this culture, it's just a reality. It's part of the makeup of this culture. But we should notice what's really important is that Paul does not ignore this reality. He doesn't ignore it. But rather, he uses this reality as an approach to speak to that lost world. And I'll show this to you in the book of Acts. And this is really interesting. In Acts chapter 17, verses 22 and 23, we see the text there. And it says, "So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God.'" So Paul had an opportunity to speak in the middle of the Areopagus. That was an area that they would hold trials. That was an area that they would debate. It was an area where they would just discuss important matters. And notice the way that Paul addresses the people here. It's very interesting. And I would go farther and I would say it's strategic. And it's the driving force behind strategic evangelism. So if you get what Paul is doing here, everything else will make sense. Listen to verse 22 again. Men of Athens, I perceived in every way that you are very religious. Super interesting. Why do you think he'd word it this way? Why do you think he'd say it this way? What is he doing here, Paul? Flatter? Yeah, I'll take the second one. Yeah, there's a level of respect going on here. Absolutely. Anyone else want to add to that? Why would he do this? Okay. He's trying to connect with them? Yeah, sure. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that. Now, if you were in the mall right now, tomorrow, and you stood up in one of a situation like this, and you looked at the people in the mall, and you said, I perceive you are very religious, right? You know, I saw an inscription to the unknown God. You would never say that. And the reason why you wouldn't say that is because it doesn't exist in your culture, right? It would make sense to say that. But Paul, that's in that culture. He's living and breathing in that world. If you were raised in a culture where there were these little g gods everywhere, it's likely that they're near and dear to you, right? And the reason why he's doing this, it's likely because he's trying to respect, secure their attention, right? And not drive them away. Now, when I was 26 years old, I'll tell you a personal story. There was a situation in my life where my wife and I were not Christians at the time, and I was a poorly raised Protestant, and she was raised Catholic. And on one particular day, my wife and I were sitting with a group of Christians, and they had no ill intent in the conversation. They were trying to explain the gospel to the best that they could. But their primary means of approach was to attack the Catholic faith. That was their primary means of approach. And now the information that they stated was not wrong. It was right? They were talking about Catholics being works-based. They went down that path, sure. But what this approach did for my wife is she felt as though they were attacking her directly, right? You're just attacking me. And so what she did was what we would all do is just you'd shut our ears and no longer listening, right? And you have to see, is that what Paul's doing here, you know? There is a way to speak to people that you can just push them away, right? There's a way to speak to people that you get them to walk and go in the other direction. And you can do it in just a few. If you've been married long enough, you know. There's a way to speak to somebody where you can just say a few words and they're turning the switch off and they're going the other way, right? And you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not asking for show of hands. But the opposite is true as well. There is a way to speak to someone, whether it be your parents, or your wife, and you can speak to them in a way that can hold their attention, right? To keep their attention. And I'll tell you, when we were first married, my wife is amazing. I'm sorry to pick on you tonight, but she would say I'll tell you now, being married for 20 years, she'll say to me, "Could you explain to me how you got to that decision?" And it's such a nice way to say, what are you doing? You know what I mean? And it's amazing. But there's a way to say, what are you doing, without saying, what are you doing? You know what I mean? It's, could you just explain to me, like, how did you get to this decision? You know? There's a way to speak to someone that's so much kinder, and you're holding my attention, actually. And I reason through it, well, I don't know. I'm not really sure. And, whatever it is. And what Paul does here, Paul does here is just beautiful. Men of Athens, I perceive that you're very religious. There is something that's true about their culture, and Paul did not have to squint his eyes very hard to see this. And at the hospital I work at, there's a chapel there, and once in a while I'll go in there, and you, as you might expect, in any chapel in Boston, if you're in that chapel long enough, you'll have Muslims that will come into that chapel. And if you've been around Muslims, what you'll notice is that they'll pray 5 times a day. And it's like this rote prayer, and it happens in the morning before daylight, it happens at breakfast time, around lunchtime, in the evening, and then after dark. And it's very rote, and you could say the very same thing in this culture. You could say something like that. I perceive you're very religious, right? And if you're in that chapel, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Men of Athens, I perceive that you're very religious. And so I think I said this one already. So step 1 would be, I think I'm past it. I got to keep up with my slides, huh? Step 1, don't alienate your audience at the very outset. And the way that Paul does this is by making a truth claim about the people that he's speaking to. So we don't want to shut the gospel door before people have had the opportunity to hear the gospel. Does everyone see that? All right. Now, is Paul avoiding or evading the issue? Is he avoiding the issue? He's not avoiding it. He's bringing it up. Yeah. He's not, right? If Paul were to end this conversation in verse 22, just stop it right there. Yes, he would be avoiding the issue, right? But one of the things that we need to realize, he's being tactical in the way that he approaches his audience. There's a sense that from verse 22, he's now going to use this cultural indicator as a launching pad, right? That I perceive that you're very religious. He's going to use this as a launching pad. So let's read verse 23 again. For as I passed along and observed the object of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. For as I passed along and observed the object of your worship, I passed along and I observed. I passed along the world that you live in. I passed along and I observed something in the world, in your world. And I observed the objects of your worship. And I noticed what you're worshiping, right? He's connecting with this culture. He's connecting with this world, the world that he's in. He has not avoided the real issue, but rather he's entering into their world. He's entering into the world, is what he's doing. And I suspect that Paul was the kind of guy, when he would get into a culture, he would have entered their world, he would not have been afraid to walk around, to take a look at this culture, to take a look at what they were into. He was the kind of guy that would not be afraid to get his hands dirty, and I suspect that. And this is interesting because Paul is someone, right? Paul is someone who was raised as a strict Jew. And to get he would have been cautious to follow the strictest Jewish laws. And now he's walking into Athens, right? And he's not afraid to get his hands dirty anymore. And it's, you can see this is a completely different person. This is the Apostle Paul, obviously, but there's a sense that, and he's getting his hands dirty in their world, right? This was a tent maker in their world, right? In their culture. I have been in healthcare for 20 years, and I've seen many different types of doctors. And what I've realized, like every other profession, is that there are doctors, and then there are doctors. And some are mediocre, some are good, and then every once in a while, I get to meet a physician, and there's a sense that I'll say this about them: that's everything I want in a physician. And in order to get me to say something like this, you have to be brilliant, and you have to have a great way with patients. And when you use your hands, you have to not be afraid to get your hands dirty, and you have to be very skillful with your hands. And so Paul is in his culture, and he's looking at this world, and he knows how to apply the gospel to it. He's not avoiding the real issue. He's being strategic, right, with the use of his words. Paul passed along the world that they lived in. He observed their objects of worship. There was a sense that Paul is saying, I'm connecting with your world. I'm connecting with your world. And I see what you see. And I understand what you understand. Paul understands that their objects of worship are near and they are dear to them. They're important to them, right? And it's very possible that someone in this audience that he's speaking with just yesterday, maybe they went and they're worshiping these objects, right? Probably was the case. Maybe they paid sacrifice yesterday. And Paul has no problem speaking about these objects of worship. But why? Why is he doing this? Why does Paul mention, or why does he bring this up, these objects of worship? Of all the things that you could talk about Paul, why would you bring this up? And the reason is because there's a huge contact point between something in their world and something in the gospel, right? There's a contact point between their world and the gospel. And just imagine with me for a minute, just walk with me in this thought. As Paul was walking through Athens, there's a street vendor there, and they're selling food, and Paul grabs a meal, right? And Paul was walking around, and he's walking around the streets in Athens, and he sits down, and he takes it all in, right? And he's looking around, and something in particular caught his attention, right? And he looks down, and there is that altar, right? And it says there, an altar to an unknown. We're not going to get into any of that, but Paul was likely thinking, you worship many gods, but you don't worship the real God, right? The worship that you're doing is in vain. And Paul would pick up on this inscription, and that inscription came from their culture. Their culture. Now, if you were to walk out of this church, and if you were to go to every other country of the world, what you would notice in all these countries, they have different things in their cultures. They have different cultural indicators. You leave this area, you go to Boston, and you'll notice that Boston has different cultural indicators than it does over in Western Massachusetts, right? And so, in this specific situation, Paul would pick up on this inscription. This inscription came from their culture. And after he picked up this inscription from their culture, he's now going to use it in evangelism to this community here at the Areopagus. So evangelism, if you remember, is giving the gospel with the aim to persuade. We said that in the first class. Well, what Paul is doing then is he uses something in their culture and he gives the gospel to them with the aim to persuade them to believe. So could the people of Athens, could they deny this altar to the unknown God? Could they deny it? Could the people of Athens deny this was a viable, real part of their culture? They couldn't deny it, right? They couldn't. They would have to say, yeah, you're right, Paul. You're right. Actually, I grew up worshiping these lowercase g gods. This was a part of my life for 40 years, right? No, they couldn't deny it. And I was reading that there were so many altars to the unknown God. There's so many of these. You would have walked by one every day, potentially. And what Paul's going to do with this inscription to the unknown God is he's going to use this now as a launching pad. So no one today would ever do this, right? But Paul's going to use this inscription as a launching pad. But this is the culture that people were in. So we go back to that initial story I was telling you about Dr. Trotter. He was in a culture that had a strong distaste for the Roman Catholic Church. Do you think that was a cultural indicator? Sure. That was one of the things that he had to be aware of, and he learned, right? And that was one of the ways that he helped this culture, helped give the gospel to this culture. You know, and I think that's kind of what I was saying. There was an issue on the ground that he connected with. With strategic evangelism, what we do is we're taking a hard look at our culture. We squint with our eyes a little and see the culture for what it is. And what are the culture indicators? So what we do then is we apply the gospel to it. So just going to move slides a little bit here. So what's going on in this culture? Well, we can say this culture is polytheistic, so worshiping many gods, right? Could we say this about our culture? Could we say there's a ton of gods in this culture? Yeah, there's some commonalities here. Yeah, sure. There's an ignorance to the real God, right? Why? why do they worship so many of these gods, right? Why are they doing this? And we can speculate about why they would have worshipped these gods, but maybe by, oh, sorry, there's a hand up. Yep. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that, because it's exactly where I was gonna go. We're talking about appeasing the gods, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate you sharing that. How often do we see Facebook posts that are hateful? How often do we see things that just just slam the gospel door shut? How often do we put things online and we see things online? I'm just like, that actually should not be there. You should not be posting that online, because instead of connecting with them and holding their attention, they just shut the door. And you mentioned the word nice, and that's where my brain was going. But thank you for sharing that. Back to the gods. Many feel as though they need to appease the gods, right? Got to appease these gods. Got to keep the gods on their side. Got to keep their gods happy, right? And we want to make sure we're continuing to be blessed by these gods. And who wants the gods to be angry with you, right? You and I may sit here and say, this is a bunch of nonsense, and we know there's no truth to this. However, in this culture that they're living in, that's what matters, right? This is it. They think it's true, and we need to show them that they're wrong. And Paul does this by taking their storyline and challenges it with the gospel, is what he does. And so Paul enters their world, and he reads that storyline back to their culture, right? So, and he shows how the gospel is the real answer to their existential need. The very thing that you worship is lacking in real substance. And you will not find the happy ending that you desperately need. And Paul gives them Jesus as the fulfillment of their storyline. Paul tells them that Jesus is the answer that their culture's storyline is looking for. Jesus is the unknown God, right? That they want to worship, but they don't actually know his name, right? And the unknown God can be the known God, and he has a name, and his name is Jesus, right? Let me show you who the real God is, right? The one that you can know. And I think you know where I'm going here. This is a great example. It's a blueprint of how we can interact with our culture in our situation. And, I was just talking to someone about evangelism, and they were saying to me how our culture is so different now. If you think about everything that's going on right now in our culture, you have the social media, you have people kind of turning inward, you have a different world that you live in now. My grandmother, when she was saved by watching the TV, watching a Billy Graham on TV, It's not the world that we live in now. And we have to ask, what's the context on the ground in our culture, right? And Another reason why I found this text to be very helpful, it's because I find it can be a knee-jerk response when people become Christians to want to separate from the world, want to get out. And I was in a Bible study once, and there was a gentleman in the Bible study years ago who said, I just want to live on a farm somewhere all by myself. I don't want to be anywhere near the world, right? And many things in our culture are things that we should stay away from, check, yes, but we shouldn't be ignorant of them, right? And Paul doesn't see this cultural indicator as mere nonsense, right? No, he uses this indicator as a launching pad for the gospel message, right? So Paul, the disciples, the church, you and I, we're called out of the darkness, right? And then we can go back into the darkness and be light and shine light. And so we can enter back into the world of darkness and shine light in whatever culture we find ourselves in. As I was thinking this past week, I was thinking how interesting it is that Paul was called out of the world of being a Pharisee. Like, it's just, and you think about what that would mean, that he would part ways. You would think that what Paul would do is, if he was a Pharisee and then became a Christian, doesn't say, I will never step foot in a synagogue again. No, there is a sense that he says, not only am I going back to the synagogue, I'm going back there to tell them the truth, right? And Paul's desire to go back into the synagogues comes from a heart that's been changed. And we should see that it's a heart condition of Paul that sends him back into the synagogues. And out of that heart, we get Romans 9:3, which is, this is Paul talking about his brothers. He says, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh, right? And what's Paul saying there about the people he walks side by side with in the darkness? He calls them my brothers, right? Not just random people over there. Those are my brothers. And his love for them was such that he would want to die so they could know Christ, right? And so I guess, the question is, how do we demonstrate the truth of the gospel from the Bible to our world, our own world, using our cultural text indicators that surround us? So what are some, let's do this first. Cultural indicators can be a multitude of things. A multitude of things in a culture that shapes its thoughts and values. We need to see the connectedness between the cultural indicators and the cultural worldview. And I want you to see today how easy this is to pick up on. And we're going to do some of this. And you're going to see how easy this is. The cultural indicators themselves are the lenses through which we see the world, and they help us interpret the world. And so I want you to look at these steps. And the steps are leave, listen, see, and apply. So it's leave the gospel door open. If I have an opportunity to speak with someone in this world, the last thing I want to do is, before they get to that gospel, is to shut the door, is to drive them away before they've heard the gospel message. And, so many people have, left the church in different instances, and I often wonder, did you ever really hear the true gospel? Listen to the story. Listen to the story. Point number 2. Listen to their story. See the cultural indicator, whatever that is, and we're going to see a good one today. Apply the gospel. Okay, so let's get practical. As we look at the greater culture that we live in, what are some huge, glaring at us in the United States, in the face, cultural indicators? What are some huge cultural indicators that we have in the United States right now? What are our idol to the unknown God things in our world right now? Possessions. Yes, that's a good one. Someone said something? Love of money, yeah. Lauren, was that you? Hollywood, yeah, absolutely. You guys are getting this 100%. Yeah. What other culture indicators? Sports, yeah. Sports, it certainly is, yeah. Age, yeah. Yeah, yes, absolutely. People want to live forever nowadays. Yeah, sure. Botox is going to fix that too, right? Here we go. Moving on. And science is our God. Okay, yeah, absolutely. All right, ruffle some feathers. What about Beyonce? What about Donald Trump? Immigration, DEI, Elon Musk. There are tons of cultural indicators in our world right now. Just tons. And you guys named a bunch. And we could probably go on for the rest of the night talking about cultural indicators, right? And I know there are people that are thinking, I don't want to talk tonight about any of those cultural indicators. It's not what I came here to do. But the reason why I bring this up is because as we interact with our world, these cultural indicators can be launching pads for the gospel. Let's just pick one. Let's understand how Paul helps us with this topic. For the record, I'm not trying to ruffle any feathers. I just want you to see this concept, okay? All right, case scenario. Here we go. Case scenario. All right, Ben. Ben is our case scenario today. So you're working at the place of employment like you always do, and you were assigned to work with a new coworker, and his name is Ben. And your job is to train the coworker. You'll be spending a lot of time with Ben. And you come to find out Ben is obsessed with Elon Musk. So step one, when I've done this in the past, I've used Beyonce, but I feel like she's not really a thing now. So step one, don't shut the gospel door on this person, right? Before you have an opportunity to give him the gospel, regardless of how you feel about Elon Musk. In this situation, we need to listen. Okay, this is crucial right here. This may seem like an obvious statement, but I can tell you it's not. Have you ever called a company like Comcast or Verizon, and you're looking to speak with someone who is human, and you get an automated response, and the person on the other line of the computer says, "What did you say? Would you like to speak to billing +1 for yes or 2 for no?" And you get so angry, right? And you just want to reach the phone and break the computer, right? You know what I'm talking about. Maybe you've had a conversation with your husband or your wife, and they're saying, he is just not listening. She is just not listening. And you guys know exactly what I'm saying. A wife said once about her husband that he couldn't hear her speak to him 5 feet away, but if a bag of chips was opened a quarter mile away, like she could hear it just fine. And I want to say something about listening. Being a good listener is crucial, and we can't miss this part today. If I can give you a take-home part, it would be this one. Proverbs 18:13 says this: "If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame." Your ears are an essential tool of evangelism because they allow you to gather information. Some people are better listeners than others. However, if you want to be a good listener, it will take practice. Every one of us in this room can be a good listener if we haven't already. Listening can be one of the most effective tools that God gave us to help another person. And I want to just spend a minute right here and discuss this, because I think every one of us has opportunities to grow in this area. I sincerely believe that this can be one very effective tool in evangelism is listening. If there was one guy that was busy, and as one guy that was too busy to listen, it was Jesus. He was too busy to listen, and he was healing people left and right, and there were crowds surrounding him, following him, and people were being dropped from the ceiling, and they were being healed in front of him, and people were reaching for his clothes, right, to be healed. And yet, if there's one person you would think that had, and when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. This is the King of the universe walking down the street, surrounded by his disciples, surrounded by a great crowd, right? But on the roadside, there was a beggar who was sitting, and he called this name Jesus. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many rebuked him, right? But he kept saying, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And notice the text, it says, and Jesus stopped and said, "Call him," right? In the busyness of life, we see those words, those two words. Jesus stopped, right? He stopped. He stopped everything he was doing. He stopped the whole procession that was following him, and he stopped and he stooped down to tend to the needs of a man who was calling his attention. Do you know what this does for people when you stop to listen to them? It invites another person to exist. It sends a message that says, "You matter. You matter." It acknowledges a person's value and personhood. That beggar in that society had little to no value in the eyes of many, right? And Jesus stopped, and he heard his concerns. And I have so many stories about people in my life who stopped to listen to me. Too many in this class, too many to listen to this class, but I'll give you one. I was in a small Baptist church, and my kids were young, and there were so many moving pieces in my life. And there was an elder there by the name of Larry. And after church, during fellowship time, we sat and we had coffee and donuts, whatever we did after church. And after church, he looked at me and he said, "How you doing?" And I gave him the usual, "I'm doing fine. I'm busy, doing fine." And he looked at me again and he said, "We're all busy, Josh. How are you doing?" And little did he know how badly I needed someone to talk to that day. How badly I needed someone to listen to my story, right? How badly I needed to give someone the weight of my life, right? "How you doing?" "We're all busy, Josh. How are you doing?" That's someone who really, truly wanted to listen to my concerns, right? When you listen, not only does it say you matter, when you listen, it alleviates the weight that the person is carrying. So many carry weight internally, and they just need an outlet. They just need someone that they can trust to share their struggles, right? And so for some reason, when people can explain, when they can talk to you, it allows them to handle the situation better than prior to being able to talk to you, right? When they can get that off their chest. And I put here, the third one is, don't turf your responsibility to listen. This is really important. I can tell you about an experience where I failed pretty miserably at this one. I was at a prior church that I worked at. We didn't have a spot to do baptisms, and so it was wintertime, and what we did was we borrowed another church's baptismal pool to do baptism inside. And the young man that we baptized that day, his name was Colby Medeiros. You guys may remember him. This story is not about Colby. But after that event, we were downstairs, and we were in the fellowship room, and there was a young man who I was talking to. I don't know his name. And he found out that I was in healthcare. And he started opening up to me about his life, and he connected with me about how he wanted to go into the profession of healthcare, and he opened up to me about his failures to believe the message of the gospel. Those were not his exact words, but that was the essence of what he was saying to me. And now to my right, out of the corner of my eye, was a man who I knew taught classes in evangelism. So I made it a point to bring him into the conversation, right? And what happened at that interaction was the man who was competent in evangelism just started hitting this young man with questions. Just hitting him with questions. One question after another. And I could see this young man who was speaking to just completely check out. Like he withered like a flower that has never been watered, just withered away. Right? And I considered it failure on my part because I was the one that was listening to him. Why did I need to bring him in, right? And while I say that to tell you while I was speaking there, when you're speaking to people, there can be this beautiful organic opportunity, right? People have this free ability to express their views to you. And there was a connection that people get that where they don't feel judged or interrupted or berated, right, or redirected. And if I was a good listener that night, I would have just stayed right there in that conversation. So I can tell you, when I speak about listening, I do it from a standpoint of someone who needs to get better at it, right? And we need to make sure that we are really listening, not just waiting for our turn to debate. And when we listen, we want others to feel heard. I want them to feel understood. And I'm not listening, just waiting for my turn to talk, right? Questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? Anything about this that doesn't make sense? Yep. Could you rephrase the question? The cultural indicators. Yes. So the cultural indicators, is that what you're asking? What are some cultural indicators? For Ben, which we're going to go over, it was Elon Musk, and we're going to discuss that. Yeah. I don't know if that's the question you're asking, though. Okay, all right. When we're talking about listening, we have a listening ear, we're understanding, we're feeling, and at some stage, once they felt they have been heard, they've been understood and empathized with, they will reciprocate, okay? So there's someone who said to me once, if you give someone 10 minutes, they'll give you 1 minute. And so when we feel safe and unhurried, we're more likely to express what's going on with us. The other thing that can be helpful, and I'm purposely spending a minute here because this is important, with listening is it allows this person to organize his or her thoughts. And as they're speaking, they're organizing their thoughts. Their words are being formulated to express what's going on with them. Okay, back to our case scenario with Ben. You have been talking to Ben over a number of weeks. And you get to talking to Ben, and there are some key comments that you've heard with Ben. And there's a trend that you've heard in conversations with Ben, and this person is talking about the corruption in our country, right? They're talking about how people have vandalized the Tesla dealerships and Tesla cars, and these comments, in addition to other comments, have allowed you to see this. This person really likes Elon Musk. And so they're happy that Musk is cleaning up the waste and fraud in this country. And now if you listen to his words carefully, his words often express the feeling behind the words. And sometimes when people say, when they give us our words, they're hiding feelings behind them. Someone may ask you, how do you handle depression, right? And what they're really saying often is, I'm depressed, right? And then you keep listening to them, and behind that is, I'm afraid, right? And when people start talking and you're listening, they'll drop hints. And so you have to be able to pick up on them. And with Ben, you're doing that really well. You're listening to Ben, you're listening well, and you go home and you pray about the situation. You think, what is the existential cry of Ben? What is the existential need of Ben? What do you come away with? He's going to fix everything. Elon Musk is going to fix everything. In the mind of Ben, that's perfect. He's our last hope for the restoration of this country. Yeah, or he may not even know it, right? He's in the mind of Ben, Musk is America's savior. He's our only hope. America is headed down the drain, and Elon Musk is our answer, right? And let's ask the question. Can Elon Musk, I guess which slides, can Elon Musk, right, deliver or fill the void? Yeah. Who are we talking about? Yeah. Yeah, I'm tracking now. It took me a second, yeah. He's setting himself for failure. And he may not even know it, right? Yeah. Can Musk deliver or fill the void? It's obvious. No, he can't. Can he deliver on the existential need? No, he can't, right? That's obvious. Absolutely not. He can't do that, right? Now, one day, you're working with Ben. And now you have to basically take something in Ben's culture and connect it with the gospel. I want to take a minute and take any questions that have come up in your brain. Questions, comments, concerns. Anything that doesn't make sense here. You've listened to Ben, and you've had the opportunity to speak into Ben's life now because you've been listening to Ben. And you see, often you just hit people with the gospel, and they just basically, it comes across very cold, and you're not doing that, right? And we gave Ben the opportunity to tell his story. That's what you've done. You've heard him. You've heard what they said, and you've understood what he said. He feels that you know where he's at. And your goal with Ben now is to help him understand that he's fulfilling this existential cry with the wrong thing. As Michael said, he's setting himself up for failure here, right? And so, basic response. You can word this however you want. You know, Ben, I've been listening to you talk about Elon Musk and how he's fixing many of the financial issues that we have in our country. I think deep down, you're truly saddened by the corruption that you see in the world around us. But even if Elon Musk fixes all the financial problems in our country, which is not possible, there will still be a problem. You see, so many in our world don't know the reason why they're here, the purpose for their existence. Ben, can I share something with you? And then my bet would be to put my story in there. I would say something like, listen, Ben, I'm going to tell you my story. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, at church by my mom and dad. And I didn't have it figured out, Ben. But for me, church was just this place that I would get dressed up to go to on a Sunday morning. My dad was a truck driver. We were a family of 6. I had no relationship with Jesus. I mean, I sang the songs, Ben, Jesus Knows Me, and Amazing Grace, I sang those songs. But Ben, I grew up one day, and like many others, I went my own way. Well, guess what, Ben? It didn't work, and I struggled through college like a kid who's lost his way. But then someday, one day, someone explained the story. Someone told me the reason for my existence. And they told me about this man whose name is Jesus. You see, Ben, it didn't make sense to me until someone explains it. And then at this point, you can word that however you want. Put your story in there. At this point, I would throw in the 4 C's of the gospel. I would explain the gospel message right there. I'm not going to go over the 4 C's again because I've done it at least 2 weeks now. but here would be another opportunity to give those 4 C's of the gospel. Was that too complicated? Was that too hard? Professionally simple. Yeah, keep it simple. Yeah, absolutely. The only way you get an opportunity to speak into Ben's life is if God places Ben in front of you. It's the only way. But if God places Ben in front of you, it's crucial that you use your time with him strategically. So often people who become Christians think they have to remove themselves from the world, the culture that we live in, and we don't think about, no, we're called back into this culture, and there are indicators in this culture that can help me, give the gospel to this person who is nothing like me. Ben is nothing like me, right? But I can use his cultural indicators, something in his world. He's got an inscription to the unknown God there, and I can see it. His name is Elon Musk. That's his deal, right? And I'm going to get into your culture. I'm going to get into your world. And I'm not going to rise above you and hover over you. I'm going to go into your world, and I'm going to reach you where you're at. There's a story so one of my favorite professors, his name was Dr. Lamerson. And if I had a picture, I'd put him up there. I just love this guy for all the years I was in seminary. He told us a story about a pastor who was coming home from a conference. This is long before GPS. And after he got home, on the way home from the conference, his car broke down. And it was in a really shady section of town. And so it was late at night, and he pulled the car over, and did I say the car broke down or he got lost? I'm trying to remember. No, he got lost. That's what it was. He got lost. And I'm trying to get my story straight here, guys. And then what happened was he went into what looked like an old abandoned building near him. And when the pastor got in there, what he realized is that this is the kind of building that women hang out in at all hours of the night that he wasn't supposed to be in. And so the pastor, the owner was there, and the pastor said to him, hey, I'm a pastor. I'm leaving the conference, and I don't know where I'm going. Can you help me? And while he was there, he heard one of the girls talk about how it was her birthday the next day. And so the pastor went home, and he told his wife, hey, last night, he told her the whole story. I walked in this building, and there were these women everywhere, and, and he told the wife the story. And he goes, tomorrow, can we bake a cake and can we bring it back to that building? And so the next day, the pastor and the wife go back to that building at some crazy hours of the night, and they bring the cake for this young woman in that building. The owner sits down with the pastor and he says, what kind of pastor are you that would do that for a girl like that? That's the kind of pastor that I think I could follow. That's the kind of church I think I could go to. See, what he did was he basically connected with their world. Didn't rise above it, connected with their world. And we could tell stories for hours on that one, but we'll keep going here. All right, so steps. Leave, listen, see, and apply. Leave the gospel door open. Listen to the story. See the cultural indicators, whatever it is. It's going to be different 10 years from now. Apply the gospel into the indicator. Don't alienate. Listen carefully. Pray. Use whatever indicator you're given. Use your story. Use the 4 C's of the gospel or whatever system you have already memorized. And let's say you're speaking to someone and they say, I'm an atheist. Okay. Your knee-jerk response may be to stop listening, maybe debate them, right? But before you do that, hear them out. How did you get here? How did you become an atheist? Quite often when people become atheists, there's a huge story there, right? Maybe they tell you you're Muslim. How did you get here? Are your parents Muslim? Were you born Muslim? Did you grow up Muslim? Or did you make a decision to become Muslim later in life? Ben was obsessed with Elon Musk. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's music. How many people are obsessed with music in our culture? I mean, I feel like half the nurses are talking about which concert they're going to. Maybe whatever it is, whatever the indicator it is, we listen to their storyline and their culture. And then we hear, what is the existential cry? That there's a void being filled, that needs to be filled here. And it's being filled with something else that's not Jesus. Okay, another cultural text. And this is maybe rough. This might ruffle a few more feathers. Well, let's say you're sitting next to a college friend, and you team up with this college friend to do a project. And this college friend comes, and he has got his car, and he's blasting Eminem, the rapper, right? And you know it's Eminem because you listened to Eminem, the rapper, as an unbeliever. And when I was in college in the 90s, this was the rapper of the day, right? Eminem. And then you meet with this person in this project, and you've listened to this person's worldview, and you think, and you remember, I know the worldview of that rapper, right? The worldview of Eminem was he connected with a real-life Caucasian kid growing up in the projects. And you listen to this person you're doing a project with, and you listen to him and you listen to him. What you realize is that his worldview connects with that rapper. He's a white Caucasian kid who grew up in the projects. And his worldview is, my life is terrible. There's no hope, right? And you may ask yourself, is there a cultural indicator in the rap music that he's listening to? And Van Hooser, in Everyday Theology, he wrote this. So many people today are searching for anything that acknowledges and validates their experience of hurt or alienation and dissatisfaction, especially in the eyes of the working poor and those in the underclass. Rap itself can express a vehicle of salvation, one's last hope for a transcendence. That's Dr. Van Hooser on Everyday Theology. So many in our world connect to that worldview. My life is terrible. I've been giving a raw deal. I own nothing of value. I can't keep a job. What's the existential cry? The existential cry is a relief for the real pain in this world and the pain that my sin nature has caused. There's an existential cry in that. Jesus he is the answer to that existential cry. The whole book of Luke talks about this, right? And so this, all right, so I have 1 minute, right? Homework assignment for next week. Just think about your story. Think about your life story and your conversion story, because that's where I'd like to go next week. Any last questions, comments, or concerns? Megan. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Megan. Yeah. Yeah, we could all listen a little better. I'll put myself in that category as well. Yeah. Any other closing comments? Charlie? Mhm. Well, you know what? I, I think it's evangelism is tied to prayer. And so when you think about the fact that we have lost family members, we have lost aunts, uncles, and we don't convert them. And so if you are wanting to reach them, we really need to be praying for them, on an everyday basis. I don't know if that answers your question, but prayer is a huge component of this. Mhm. Let's close in prayer. Speaking of prayer, dear Heavenly Father, awesome and holy God, dear Lord, I pray that you just guide us as we go about the rest of this week, Lord. Would you allow us to see this world for what it is? This is a lost world, Lord. And Lord, you have called us out of the darkness to go back into this world and to be light and salt to this dark world. Would you allow us to give us the hearts, Lord, to listen, Lord, to the culture that we live in, Lord, and give us the wisdom to be able to see whatever cultural indicator you want us to see, Lord. And I pray that we would just pour our life and stand in the gap for those who don't know you, Lord. In dear Jesus' name we pray. Amen.